So, welcome to Module 1, which is an introduction to the course. And this is lesson 1.1. What is theoretical history all about? And there are a number of themes I want to discuss. The first one is that theoretical history is about the search for patterns in history. And this is not necessarily superficial patterns, like saying, what's happening in the United States today is just like the fall of Rome. But it's about looking for less obvious things, underlying patterns. So we might find, for example, that empires have an average lifespan, or we might find that 50% of empires last 100 years, another 20% of empires last 200 years, and then another 10% lasts 300 years, and so on. There's a statistical pattern. And the key thing here is that it's based on data. So data about the lifespans of empires or about the maximum extent of empires. And then, having discovered patterns, it's about developing theories to explain why those patterns occur. So if we find that there's an average lifespan for empires, then maybe someone can come up with a theory as to why it is what it is. It might be related to the human lifespan, for example. Then the next thing to discuss is that theoretical history involves the scientific style. And traditionally people have distinguished between ideographic disciplines, which are concerned with the investigation of special cases, particular cases, and nomothetic disciplines, which are concerned with the discovery of general laws. And history has traditionally been thought of and practiced as an ideographic discipline. Historians study the Crimean War, or another historian might study World War II, rather than studying war as an abstract phenomenon. But as theoretical historians, we're not interested in that ideographic approach, but we're taking a nomothetic approach. We are interested in the discovery of abstract principles and general laws rather than studying particular phenomena. And it's not a question of which is wrong, which is right. These are just different ways of approaching the same material. Now, the ideographic approach then is concerned with what is unique, what is different about each special case that it investigates. So it's not much use studying the Crimean War and then coming back and saying, oh, well, it was just like any other war. You want to find out what was unique about it, what was different, what special contribution it made to historical change. Whereas with the nomothetic approach, we are interested in what is common to the Crimean War and other wars. We're trying to find out what doesn't change in all the different particular cases. What we're interested in, not what is different, but what is staying the same. And a problem with this is that if you're a theoretical historian studying empires, let's say, you're going to be interested in the Akkadian Empire and the Roman Empire and the British Empire. And somebody who studies each of those, says someone who studies the Akkadian Empire, is going to say, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. You've read a few books, but you don't really understand the nuances of what's going on. Your appreciation is rather superficial. And similarly, someone who specializes in the Roman Empire is going to say, you don't really know what you're talking about with the Roman Empire because you haven't studied it for 20 years like I have. So this naturally makes mainstream historians suspicious of what theoretical historians are doing. And something that exacerbates that is that because historians tend to be raised to take the ideographic approach, or that's what they're interested in, that's why they study history in the first place, the people who are taking a scientific nomothetic approach to history tend to come from outside the history discipline. They come from disciplines where the nomothetic approach is common and normal, and then they're applying that approach to historical data. And so this again makes mainstream historians rather suspicious that these are people who are not historians and who haven't studied in depth the things that they're presuming to talk about. So what can we do about that? Well, the main thing is that you have to start somewhere, and as theoretical history develops, it may make mistakes and may make naive judgments, but over time those will become refined as theoretical historians keep examining their own work and improving and iterating their assumptions. But also one practical thing that can be done to develop it is to combat it is the development of history data banks. So an example is the CSHAT data bank, which systematizes historical information and presents it in a standardized format, and allows then theoretical historians to come up to speed very quickly on particular historical cases, and also to be able to compare them in a standardized way. And of course there is the problem with that of garbage in, garbage out. You need to be sure that what the information going into the historical data bank is correct and valid, and the approach that CSHAT takes is to have everything reviewed by experts in each particular case study. But that doesn't guarantee that it's 100% accurate. There are no doubt issues with what's in the data bank, but it's again a case of iteration, starting somewhere and gradually improving. The next point I want to talk about is that theoretical history perhaps has three particular outcomes, which is about predicting, shaping, and teaching. So if we have theories of history, then we can start to look at what's happening today and use our theories of history to suggest how things might evolve forward. And this is not prediction in the sense of looking into a crystal ball, fortune telling. It's the same as in other predictive sciences like physics, where you're not telling the future, you're saying that because we have an understanding of the laws of nature, we know that if certain things are true, then certain other things will follow from it. So it might be, for example, if you're trying to fire an artillery gun, you can say, well, if we put the gun at this angle to the horizon, and if we pack it with this amount of high explosive, then the shell will land over there. And similarly with theoretical history, if you're saying, well, we have an understanding of why wars break out, you're saying we can say that if these conditions are true, then war is more likely. You're not predicting a particular war to break out. That will depend on human decision making. But what you can do with your theory is, if you understand what causes wars, you can deal with the issues that are likely to produce a war if you want to prevent it. Or you can actually create the conditions for war if you want a war to break out. So you can shape events based on your ability to predict how one thing will lead to another. And lastly, it can be used for making the ideas of history easier to grasp and easier to teach, because they present them not as a random collection of facts, but as some things that fit into a framework and a pattern. And I'd like to give an example of that. So let's draw a map of the world. Something like this, and Indonesia going down to Australia. And if we plot on here the world's earliest civilizations, we had in the Americas, we had the Maya in Central America, we had the Aztecs, we had the Incas. And over here in the old world, we had, of course, Egypt and the Mesopotamian, Sumerian civilizations in the Mediterranean, the Minoan civilization, and then the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization, and then of course the early civilization of China on the Yellow River. And what we notice about these is that they tend to be in a rather narrow band, and particularly they're in more central places. So they're particularly at the junctions of land masses where there would have been quite a big flow of people and ideas. And this makes sense. You would expect civilization to develop more rapidly where there's a lot of people and a lot of different ideas coming in from all directions. And we didn't find civilization developing in Australia with a small number of people and rather remote from what was happening in the rest of the world. And so this means that the early civilizations now, instead of being just a random collection of civilizations in random places, we can start to see that they are instances of a general principle, and this makes it easier to grasp where they occurred and what forces led to their emergence. And we can also take this forward if we imagine an alien world that perhaps, well, let's draw it over here, an alien world that has continents that look like this. There's a big one there, and then a smaller one and a very small one down there. And we could say, on this world, where would we expect civilization first to develop? And I hope you'd say, based on the logic that we see there, that, well, we'd expect the civilizations of this world to have appeared there initially. Maybe one here on this smaller one, but very unlikely to have developed there. So history now becomes something whose principles we can teach and draw conclusions from. Let's get rid of that. And the next thing I'd like to talk about is the whole issue of defending. Theoretical history. So I've already said that, mainstream historians are going naturally to be rather suspicious of what theoretical historians are doing. And some people have mounted strong defences of theoretical history and said why this is a valid approach and why it could work. But I'm not going to spend any time on that. In the book I give mention some of the essays that people have written in this respect, but I take the view that you wouldn't be watching this if you didn't think that theoretical history was potentially worthwhile, and those people who think it isn't worthwhile wouldn't be watching anyway. So there's not much point in going into detail on that. And in any case, I take the view that it's not a question of whether I can persuade you that theoretical history is a good idea or not. That it's a case of let's get on with it and see where we get to. If it turns out that we come up with interesting ideas and things that help us in our understanding, that in itself will prove the validity of the exercise. It's a case of the proof of the pudding is in the eating, not based on what we decide in advance, whether it's a good idea or not. But this leads us on to the question of the reliability and meaningfulness of the historical data that we're going to be using. The military theorist Basil Liddell-Hart, who was active between the First and Second World Wars and was particularly an advocate of tank warfare as the way of the future, was an officer in the First World War. And in his memoirs, he talks about how he was in the headquarters of a French general who was dictating his report, which was being taken down by his clerk. And Liddell-Hart overheard this, and he said to the general, "But sir, that's not how it happened. It wasn't like that at all." And the French general said, "Oh, don't worry. it's only for the official record. And it's on the basis of that official record that historians then develop their theories of what happened and their accounts of what happened in the war. Obviously based on material that a general has sanitized to make his own actions look better. And I think this is why Henry Ford said that history is bunk. He meant that a lot of what passes as history is based on this kind of biased, falsified data that has been recorded by people with all sorts of agendas, and so we can't trust it. And today, in our own time, we hear a lot about misinformation, disinformation, and we know that there are issues about can we trust what we read in the media or see on the media or on people's YouTube channels. So the data we're going to be using has this pedigree. It's been distorted by people with all sorts of agendas. What can we do about that? Well, there's not an awful lot we can do except what we do in any discipline where our data has errors, or potentially has errors, which is to use statistical methods, firstly to smooth out those errors. So if we compare a lot of cases, then we can possibly assume that the errors in one direction cancel out the errors in the other direction. Obviously that's based on what is causing these errors, whether they're random or systematic. But also we can quote the uncertainty in our conclusions. So we have an understanding of how wrong our data might be, and then how wrong our conclusions might be based on it. And then as theoretical history proceeds, it will be a case of continually challenging data and iterating data. And as theories of theoretical history develop, we can use those to test the quality of the data, because as we start to have better understandings of the kinds of things that are likely and possible in history, we can possibly see where data is untrustworthy and how untrustworthy it might be, and the direction in which the biases might occur. And this is somewhere that theoretical historians can come out fighting, if you like, because a historian who studies just one particular case, just the Crimean War, is more vulnerable to inaccuracies in the evidence that they're using than a theoretical historian who is comparing lots of cases and can say, well, based on what I've learned from all these other cases, I rather suspect that what we're being told here about the Crimean War, which is at variance with everything else, is possibly mistaken. And you can then start to drill down into that. So the next point is that in theoretical history we're using formal methods. And that just means being clear about what we're saying. So using clear definitions and using words always in the same way. And that often means mathematics, because it's difficult to pull the wool over people's eyes when you're using mathematics. But it doesn't have to be mathematical, but just so long as you are clear about what you're saying, not using rhetoric to try and persuade people of your point of view. And so, for example, Peter Turchin's work, which he calls Cliodynamics, Clio is the muse of history, C-L-I-O. So in compound words, Clio means to do with history. And dynamics, Cliodynamics then is the study of dynamic processes in history. Peter Turchin is using the mathematics of calculus to study these dynamic processes and developing models using equations to show how historical variables change and affect each other. My view is that Cliodynamics is a subset of theoretical history. I take a more broader view of theoretical history, that anything that is helping us understand history in a theoretical way, not necessarily using mathematical models, even though a lot of it will be that. So, for example, the historian Arnold Toynbee, who we'll be talking about later on, developed a theory of civilizations, and he identified various moving parts of civilizations. He didn't have a mathematical dynamic model of it, but nevertheless his ideas are very helpful for us in thinking about civilizations and the structure of civilizations. It doesn't necessarily mean he was correct, but it's a useful theory that we can use. So to me, theoretical history would be anything that helps us understand history in a theoretical way. And on this subject, the mathematician John von Neumann, who was big, for example, in the early development of computers, said that calculus was developed by Newton to study the problems of physics. And there's no reason to believe that it's also useful or appropriate for solving the problems of the social sciences. And he said that social scientists, and theoretical historians would be an example of that, might have to develop their own mathematics to study their problems. And he offered game theory, which was something that he himself developed, as an example of that kind of new mathematics that is better suited for the problems of the social sciences. So whether it's game theory or some other new kind of mathematics that hasn't been invented yet, we may find that in the long term, theoretical history looks quite different from the calculus-based dynamic models of current cliodynamics. Now, the theoretical historian Graham Snooks has said that in terms of using formal methods, theoretical historians have gone through 3 phases. So the first phase he calls the metaphysical. And this is where theoretical historians develop grand theories of history. We're thinking of people like Karl Marx, their vision of history. But it's not really based on data or any kind of analysis. It's largely a product of their own imagination, with their ad hoc examples drawn from the historical literature. Then in the early 19th century emerged positivism, which is particularly associated with the sociologist Auguste Comte. And Snooks says that this was concerned with finding patterns in data. So the positivists were using the new statistics that were becoming available through modern governments in that time and finding patterns in them. But Snooks says they were only looking at a surface level. They weren't thinking about the deeper logic behind the patterns. And so then we move on to what he calls existentialism. Which is where people are concerned about the deeper logic behind events, looking at the underlying processes that produce these patterns. And this is based on data, and then finding patterns in data, and then this is based on interpreting and finding deeper logics. And that's the phase we are now. And Snooks also talks about the ingredients of the scientific method. Now, many people have written on the nature of the scientific method. Of course, the classic work is Karl Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery. And Snooks talks about the scientific method in theoretical history having 4 parts, which he says, is firstly you find patterns. So this is Snooks's idea of what the scientific method should look like applied to history. Firstly, you're finding patterns, then you're finding the dynamical processes that change those patterns over time, the way they change, and then you're trying to identify the mechanisms that generate those dynamics. And once you understand that, the mechanisms that are driving history, you can start to talk about long-term institutional change, So how we have got from, cave dwelling times to modern states. And, you can think about it in that way, but I would tend to say that there's no one right way, in fact, to do theoretical history. There's no one right way to do science. Typically, it has three ingredients. For scientific theory, there must be some data, not just your own imagination, and there must be identified some patterns in the data. If it's just random data, it's not of any interest. It's if you can find some abstractions from that data. And then lastly, you must have a theory to explain those patterns. And people tend to think it goes in this direction, that you get your data, you find your patterns, and you develop your theory. But sociologists of the scientific method would say, well, that's actually not usually how it works. Often people have a flash of inspiration and come up with a theory, and it's that motivates them to go and collect the data. So if people are working in the archives looking at data on the populations of medieval Europe, say, they're not just doing that for the hell of it, just randomly looking at that information, not with no idea of what it's going to do for them. They already have some kind of theory, or they already have some idea of the kind of patterns they're looking for, and that's what they're then doing, or that's why they're then collecting the data to see if those patterns do occur and to see if their theory can then be supported. So it can happen in the opposite direction, or you could start in the middle. You could have a flash of inspiration and say, well, it might be cyclical, it might go up and down, so let's see if we can find that in the data. And having found that it is, you then think, well, it is cyclical, so it's now worth spending time scratching my head to see if I can come up with a theory as to why it would be cyclical. So you can do it in any order, but you need those three ingredients at the end of the day.